Hi everyone. In this podcast style episode, my sister Bea and I discuss the Neptune archetype via its mythological and astrological meanings. And if you want to hear what next follows, which is the PLUTO archetype, you can already find it at our podcast site via the web link or through any podcast app on your phone. You can find all of these links in the description of this post. For here and now, enjoy this Neptune episode.
Welcome to Archetypes and the Planets, where Kahr and I, Bea Gonzalez, invite you to think metaphorically as we explore how we have collectively translated the map of the sky into our mythologies, religious systems, and personal psychology. Okay, Andre, so today we have arrived at Neptune, the planet, one of the so-called transpersonal planets that was discovered post 1781 after the first planet that was not part of the seven, the two lights and the five that were known in ancient times. And we talked about Uranus and what that might mean. And now we're going to talk about Neptune. And before we get started on this particular subject, I want to address the whole notion of transpersonal planets and what this might mean. There is a division in the astrological community. I'm a both and person. I love the Hellenistic and I love the Arabic. I love all the work that's coming out. But I'm finding a trend that is disturbing to me because I see it also in many spheres of life where, you know, when all these texts were discovered, I'm a historian at heart. I loved learning about it, but there seems to be an oppositional thing going on where you're either one or the other, but somehow we're not finding a way to blend these things together. And the thing about the transpersonal planets, and there's even an objection to them being called this way, is that they don't have standard rulerships according to the rules of the ancient astrologers, obviously, because they didn't see them. And they don't follow, I mean, there is a beauty to the way that they conceptualized rulerships and exaltations in the Hellenistic worldview. So I don't want to get rid of that. I agree with them. I use the traditional rulerships, but I'm more worried about what people have done with this. And a lot of it they blame on the Theosophists. And I want to bring this up because the Theosophists, I think, have a lot to do with Neptune. And astrology gets rediscovered through really the Theosophists and the work of Alan Leo, who, by the way, trains Jung. And so I just want to bring this up because some people may be listening to us and just enjoying the archetypal connections, and that's great. Some people may be listening to us who are doing more of a deep dive into astrology, and I want to be an advocate for having a dialogue between both. So we're not excluding one viewpoint or the other, but we're understanding where each came from. And this is something that I heard on a podcast, which I found quite extraordinary. Someone actually said, well, you know, humankind hasn't essentially changed. And that is true. Human nature hasn't essentially changed. And the 12 houses, for example, signal areas of our lives where things are pretty constant, right? But we have evolved in some ways. Our consciousness has been evolving along certain lines. You cannot compare our way of thinking to someone in 3000 BC because we're just not thinking on the same level. So it's an absurd comment to make. And I just want to be an advocate for that. Let's have a both and approach. Let's have a dialogue. Let's stop playing these games you see in politics of division and I'm right and you're wrong. And these are geometrical rules, and those are developed by people who are Neptunian. It just so shuts down the conversation. Anyway, that's my beginning of it. And the reason I will link it to Neptune is I think one thing we've said before is that astrology separated from astronomy in the 16th century with the scientific revolution, and it went underground. You know, people stopped really thinking about this in a big way, right, for a while, and then it resurfaced right when Neptune shows up. And my linking it is that, okay, so Neptune gets discovered in 1846. Discovered. One of the words I think we both agree Neptune is associated with is a certain amount of confusion. I think when Neptune is wired in, there is you tend to be a little bit in kind of the clouds, a haze. And it's interesting that Neptune actually, they figured out there must have been a planet when they discovered Uranus because of the disturbances to that orbit. So they knew there was one, but they couldn't really verify it until 1846. So there was confusion in the finding of that planet. But even more interesting, they also saw that Neptune's orbit was disturbed. And when Pluto was discovered, you'd think that that was the reason that it was that, but it had nothing to do with Neptune's orbit being disturbed. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's interesting that Neptune on both ends, it comes out of this fog of, you can't really pin it down. You can't really, categorize it in the way that we categorize, let's say, Saturn, which is very much about material reality. So let's start with that conversation. That concept is applied to Neptune.
So are you asking, though, with the Hellenistic view of astrology versus whatever other view you're maybe more modern or psychological astrology, maybe, is that what you're asking around whether or not to associate Neptune, in this case, the modernistic view as to what some astrologers do that I don't, like you, I don't agree with, to say Pisces is Neptune. It used to be Jupiter, Jupiter's thrown out, now it's just Neptune. I see Neptune at minimum associated to Pisces, and I could go further than that and say, give it co-rulership, some kind of very strong connection to Pisces. Same with Uranus. I resisted Uranus for years. I didn't like the connection to Aquarius until I understood the connection, because I could see the paradox of individuality and how it could still fit into Aquarius, but also because I noticed in my chart that the sign order, the 12th in my case, there was something connected to Uranus for sure. So then I thought, well, it must be connected because I get a transit and I get an effect to that house. And so I would say the association with Neptune to Pisces, however much you want to make that association, to my mind is valid. It's not an invalid type of thing. But I mean, if you're going to talk Neptune, yeah, the whole idea of immediately, as soon as, notice even in today's discussion, we're already floating and going like, what are we talking about here? Is this, is this up, down? Because that's Neptune's nature. It's very, very hard to pin it down. And that's the magic of Neptune, because Neptune, to my understanding on the high end, is that really open-ended, spacious peace that you can feel within yourself and your total connection and integration with life. This, I believe, by the way, was consciously or subconsciously or both Jung's entire life, his seeking. He was trying to be that very thing because he had the Neptune square, and that's the sense, Neptune square the sun. I want to integrate my individuality into the whole of humanity. So Neptune is a very inclusive energy, and it's not a defined energy because of the very same reason. You're in this space, but you can't really say, well, it's this, just this, or it's this other thing. And so therefore it's elusive, which is another Neptune keyword. And you see this, by the way, in astrology. These keywords are not made up. A person, for example, that has a very strong Neptune connection, typically through squares and oppositions and conjunctions, though not always, but most of the time it'll be that. The idea of elusive, for example, a con man, someone who is on the downside conning people, that's the very definition of elusive. They're impossible to pin down. So all of those things to the Neptune archetype. But just to answer your question about the astrology systems, I agree with you on that, both end. And in the way I do it, I constantly use whatever part of a system I believe makes sense. Even if I find the entire system not particularly appealing, I'll use a rule that may be very wise about that system.
I mean, so Neptune is an association with Pisces. So Liz Green points out that Manilius, which is one of the older texts, one of the writers that is associated with the Hellenistic tradition, does actually connect Pisces to Poseidon, who is Neptune. So I mean, that's just the connection she happens to mention. But I think the reason that, so one of the things a lot of people also, and I think you've struggled with this as well, and I think it's fine. I'm an archetypal storyteller more than I am an astrologer. You're more consulting. I'm much more interested in the stories. And so I'm very fascinated by the congruence of the myth and what we name things to what they turn out to be. And the only way you can understand this, I tried to explain this to someone the other day, is if you believe that the quality of the time that something is named or shows up or you're born actually has some meaning into it, the quality of time, right? This is what Jung understood as synchronicity. So that you are sharing with whatever was created in time, right? Those qualities, okay, with entities, with other people. When I say entities, I don't mean, extraterrestrials. I mean, if a corporation is made or whatever. But there are many archetypal expressions. They're not fixed. There's just many ways for expression. Okay, so that we can agree on. The other thing is that, and so there's no beams coming from the sky or whatever. We understand that there is an inner and outer, as above, so below. There is something connecting everything together like the glue, and we just haven't discovered what the glue is. So I look at Neptune, and we talked about this before on your channel about how weird Neptune. You'd say, well, they came up with this name, and Neptune in mythology. Let's get the archetypal storytelling aside, actually has very few stories, but they're really quite important stories. One of them is that it shows up as a major figure in the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is one of the foundational texts of Western, really everything, Western literature, Western history, Western consciousness. And it's a very instructive text because it comes after the Iliad, where the gods are speaking to you like they did. You couldn't distinguish between the gods in your head and who you were. There was no awareness or consciousness of the self. That's a big new concept for the Greeks, by the way, which is so interesting. The Odyssey is the first time we see an awareness, a self-consciousness rising, that you are not one, but two. You are the person who thinks, and you are the person who observes the thinker. That's a very new concept. It did not exist prior to that time. Okay, so we have Neptune showing up. And the reason it's important is in the Odyssey, what happens to Odysseus is he insults the son of Poseidon / Neptune. And this is what sets him on his 10-year odyssey of, he gets thrown to the winds by not being respectful of that power. And if you think archetypally, what does Neptune rule? It rules the waters. It rules the deep waters of the unconscious. And one of the ways we figure out, or we ascribe meaning to a new planet that we have not encountered before, is you look around and you say, what was going on? So we did that for Uranus. And before we get to Neptune and what was going around, because a lot was going around in 1846, which is determinative for what is going on now, I think especially we can argue that a lot of what's going now has resonances in when it was discovered, is that there's a second story most people don't know about Neptune. And this goes to the fact that I think Neptune can be really harsh in a transit. And sometimes we ignore that. We act like it's all compassion and story. And my own experience, and when I've seen it in others, is that it can be actually very, very tough to deal with, because when you are overwhelmed by the sea, by the unconscious, if you don't have a good structure to keep you, I was mentioning that in all flood myths, what are you told to do? You're told to build an ark. Why are you told to build an ark? Because that's a structure that can protect you.
Yeah.
You have a strong ego, right? You're going to be in a lot of trouble, right? So I think these two things go together. And so I think we shouldn't really, it's like people that say, oh, psychedelics are going to save all of us. Now we're testing them at Johns Hopkins, which is true. But they can overwhelm you done the wrong way. We know they can do plenty of damage. So you have to be careful with these forces. They're transpersonal, to use the word that some don't like. They're archetypal. They're beyond what we have the limited capacity, what we can control in a way. It's like an ocean coming at you. So one story I want to bring up of Neptune, just to show his bad side, is that like his brothers who go around raping and pillaging, that would be Zeus, Jupiter, and Pluto, Hades. He too is involved in a very famous rape that no one ever talks about. And that's the rape of Medusa, who is a beautiful woman, but she goes into Athena's temple and he rapes her there. And then Athena turns her into Medusa, who then has the power to scare off anybody and harden your heart. It really is a great archetypal motif for fear, okay? But that was Poseidon's doing. And I think that story can speak to what happens to you when you are overwhelmed with the unconscious. You turn into the fear. You are frozen. You become so, and we know this with people who are overwhelmed in ways that actually are very serious. They can land them in spaces where they can't get out. And I think one of the reasons we associate drug addiction with Neptune is that is a way that you can go deep into the unconscious and have no lifeboat or ark that can take you out. And then, we talk about cheap Neptune. That's the way to really get into a lot of trouble. So I just wanted to bring out I think Neptune is kind of the forgotten planet, but also I think the one that has the capacity to do a lot of damage. And we've seen it actually in our political discourse and what's been going on in the world. It's sneaky. People kind of forget about Neptune. because it is so unconscious, and you're walking around and one day you wake up and things have dwindled into misinformation, insanity, and people being overwhelmed so much by the contents of their unconscious that they can't tell if a young man shows up at the door for help or to pick up a sister or a sibling, or they're showing up to attack you. That is Neptune, one of the manifestations. Of course, there are other planets involved, but I'm just saying that we've created a world where people can't discern the truth from fact, from fiction, the good guys. It just it's all melded into the discernment has gone. And this is one of the things. Mars is discernment, of course. Neptune seems to have no discernment. You're just going to jump into the soup. And yes, if you're a good meditator, I have no doubt that you can jump into the soup and connect in a good way. But I'm going to argue that most people aren't great meditators. And so when they encounter Neptune, it's like a tidal wave. It comes over you, drowns you out, and you don't know how to get out. What's your take on this part of the Neptune story?
Well, I laughed when you said, my laughter was when you said, if there's a deluge, if there's the biblical, the Noah's Ark, well, obviously, if there's water everywhere, the solution is a boat, because otherwise, what are you going to do? I mean, and a boat would be a Saturnian thing, a structure.
Right.
So the whole idea is all of this, we can say anything about any planet, anything at all. If you are speaking from an incarnate body, that's your Saturn in a sense. Your bones are holding you up, presumably, and you say things from that limited vantage point, although you're part of the whole at the same time. But Saturn being Saturn, then that's the arc that every person needs. The arc is they themselves, meaning that, in other words, suppose now you think of the wide open Neptune. It's like you open the lens of the camera totally wide, and you've got all this stuff just moving around. Something in there is your Saturn on the level of mind that discerns. And part of the discernment can be, you can just ignore it all. That's, by the way, one of the most the deepest meditations. If you study the deepest Buddhism, basically what they're saying to you is, yeah, whatever's there, just watch it go by. And then that way you're never going to be trapped by it. But that's hard to do, because a person has their memories that they've built up, and really that's what can drive them crazy. The memories start circulating, make other memories, and then they think, oh, this is me, and that thing happened, and that makes me bad, and then all that stuff. And then that's the overwhelm, literally. So the discernment would be to bring in the Saturn to at least cooperate with Neptune, not remove the Neptune, but have it be the balancing force, so to speak. And so the good meditation is, I think, in part that you're able to enter the wide open space and not get disturbed by anything. And you brought up psychedelics, which they're also connected to Neptune, in that psychedelics, any substance that in some sense expands the internal energy, the sense of feeling within oneself, is Neptunian. But you're totally right. If you throw in some substance that in some way speeds up the psyche a lot, because typically that's what they're doing. The psychedelics, whichever effect they're having, the driver is that the nervous system acquires more voltage. So then more energy is going through, and it can be more difficult to relate to it. In that, do you have a stable enough, again, as soon as you say stable, Saturn, right? Every time. So you have a stable enough mind to navigate through there. That would be your arc, so to speak. You're in Noah's Ark, and you can watch all the rain and wait, but you're floating, you're fine. It's not a problem. But if your arc, starts to sink, then you've got a problem, because and really what it is that you get taken in by the ocean. Then you're thrown about, and it makes things really, really hard, right? The other thing you mentioned about Neptune and discovery is that, and I get a lot of this myself. Whatever was coming online, whatever was humanity was connecting to. And this is true mostly of the outer planets, because if you start looking at the previous planets, good luck with that. I mean, I don't know, that would be a great study, by the way. When was Saturn first pointed to, or that there's a planet that probably goes back millennia. Uranus, late 18th century. Neptune is coming online. To me, the key thing was that the humanity was starting to use the electricity of Uranus to create things that were enabling recordings to happen. The first photos start to show up. This thing that you're creating a replica, and this is the often the downside of Neptune, because Neptune is the faker. Neptune is the fake thing. It's not the thing. When someone gives you a recording, it's not the person, but yet it is the person, because you're hearing their voice or you're seeing them on camera or a movie. That's why Neptune is so prevalent in Hollywood. You know, people that are producing videos, you'll see Neptune somewhere important, right? So all of that is happening simultaneously, though, and this is, in a way, it's a Neptunian concept, because we're throwing all this energy out and say, well, what do you do with it? The best answer I have is pay attention to your Saturn. You know, develop your Saturn so you can manage everything. That would be the best answer.
It's interesting. Also, in 1846, Karen LaGrice makes a point that the word unconscious shows up, and I'm not sure this is true or not. I haven't verified it, but it shows up for the first time in a textbook speaking about such things. And if you look at the artists working at that time, what do you have? You have music that is highly mythological, like Wagner. You have Dostoevsky, the great Russian, coming online, writing books like The Double, where you have the idea that there's something working that you don't quite understand. In fact, the whole of 19th century literature points to an awareness of forces we have no control over. And of course, you have Nietzsche, who was born 2 years before the discovery, who's opening up a whole philosophical viewpoint that will be taken on by people like Jung and others in the 20th century. So you have a real opening of awareness that we are not who we think we are. And not only are we not who we think we are, but we're driven by forces we don't understand, and they're coming from within. We project them because, it's hard to hold these forces, but it's the first awareness of how insecure things really are in that imaginal world. And we can't forget also that beyond the imagination, of course, you have movements like in painting, Impressionism, which is kind of like thinking things are diffuse, right? But also I would argue that dreams, by the late 19th century, you have the interpretation of dreams by Freud that becomes a seminal work. And although dreams were paid attention to and very seriously in the ancient Greeks, going back to classical Greece, they really were not paid attention in the same way until they come online again, and they become a way to get into the unconscious that Jung explores. You say about Jung having a Neptune square the sun, that did drive. And in fact, one of the things he struggled with was being labeled a mystic, which you can agree is another Neptune word, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot of so-called mysters like Meher Baba, and actually people involved in the spiritual circles of all stripes, Billy Graham, all these people had Neptune wired into their charts, and they're almost voice pieces for a specific form of Neptune that is being brought out into the world. Whether you agree with it or not is actually irrelevant. It's that they are manifesting something some people are resonating to, right? Mm-hmm. On the issue of Saturn Neptune, we're about to get that conjunction happening in 2025 or 26 in the 0 degree point of Aries, which is kind of interesting because from the tropical viewpoint, that's the first beginning of the tropical year. And one of the interesting conjunctions of Saturn Neptune, and I don't know if it's in the publication of Das Kapital or if it's actually in Marx's chart, but it's compassion with structure, right? Well, how it was applied later is irrelevant. But what he was trying to do is he was trying to take the highest level of Neptune, which is compassion, and give it a structure and say, okay, what we need is the means of production have to be, whether that was realizable in the world or not is not part of the question. Is that he had a vision of what this would be like, and it is a particularly good Saturn Neptune example of what it would be like. And so it'd be interesting to see now that it lands in Aries. What is the new vision? What are these two coming together going to produce, right? Because it seems to me that for all of Neptune's wonkiness, there is a level of compassion wired into it, or the idea that we are one, because in the ocean, no drop is separate from any other drop. We are one, but at the same time, we're separate. So these two are so different, but in combination. And one thing that I thought was very interesting, the best book on Neptune is by Liz Green. If anybody wants to tackle the 800-page volume, it's fabulous. One thing she points out is if you look at artist charts, you often find Saturn square Neptune, and it makes sense because they're bringing form to the formless. They're taking things in the unconscious and they're formatting it. They're making it real so that you can consume it. Music is very Neptunian. She also comments in that book about how incredible is how many artists, how many musicians in particular have Neptune wired into their charts. It doesn't matter where they were born, what type of music, it is really super wired in, because music, we would agree, is something that allows us to dissolve form for a while and merge with something that is beyond us. It's beyond words, which is something Mercury oriented. So all of these things, I think, point to what happened in 1846. These things come online, and now we've seen it develop, and the shadow side has definitely come off. Now, one thing that is interesting is the U.S. chart. I think I talked to you about this before. The U.S. chart has, I think the planet at the zenith is Neptune, right?
Correct.
So that's a particularly important planet for the U.S.
And it is, but it may be being Neptune it's also in Virgo, which is when you think of Virgo, you think of the common man. Neptune and Virgo would be a very classic democratic energy. However, the US has a lot of Uranus separately because the horizon line crossed Uranus. And you can see that the US is known as the most independent thinking. When people do these studies, they say, for instance, China, they study the populace, and they're very compliant. They follow rules. In the US, no one follows any rules. It's completely brutal. The Uranus is so rampant, but yet the country with Neptune above like that, at the zenith, it's a democracy that's lasted 250 years. And I think for that reason, there's a sense that, okay, we're independent, Uranus, everybody should be able to do whatever they want. And we are a group and we're all going to get along somehow. This is the whole argument now that one side of the country is saying, well, when you lose an election, you should just accept it and go on to the next election. And one side thinks, no, we should just throw the whole thing overboard and turn it into some kind of libertarian fascist regime, which I don't think fits the country in its totality, right? But that's what makes it a melting pot. And to your point about now being I think maybe you're going in this direction, that the Neptune period we're in and all the lies and all the confusion. Neptune and Pisces, first of all, it opposes the US Mercury or Neptune. So then this was the Civil War in the 1860s. There was separately, you could argue that Neptune too is very ideological. There's a sense of what is the vision. And the clash back then was just like now, we're getting another clash. They're clashing visions. Back then it was, well, we should have this racist thing where some men can just overcome other men and enslave them. And there were a group of people that said, no, that should not be the case. And that's how that ended. We'll see in this case, but in a way, it's the same thing again, because what you're seeing another similar problem where some people are trying to be too Uranian. They're basically saying, I don't want any part of that Neptune. Well, you don't have any choice in that because it's part of the country. It's there. And probably there, in one sense, when Neptune leaves Pisces, it should help around things not being as anything goes. Because the thing about Pisces is that one side, in my opinion, has been great for bringing forth more and more and more spiritual information into the public domain. The problem is that it's been side by side with more disinformation, the insanity of the Neptune thing, anything goes. You sometimes hear people saying things like, you can't even tell anymore what the news is telling you. Yes, you can. You got to look carefully, but you can. But if you go on Facebook and open a page and someone is saying they saw pigs flying, it's up to you to discriminate and say, no, that's unlikely. I don't think that happened.
Yeah, and discernment being the fundamental problem. I would also say that in the US chart, one of the things they export the most is the vision of democracy, which they don't live up to, frankly, from the outside world. Nobody does, really. But the vision of democracy, this is the best democracy. This is, and everybody's saying, well, talking about. But just to add, they also export, one of the biggest exports is the entertainment industry, the illusion industry, right? So Hollywood is a US creation. And so everybody wants to be, I think it's interesting what's happening through entertainment, that things like Netflix are bringing other cultures back in, but really the standard has been set traditionally by the US. And, certainly in our lifetime and before, the people who've had power in that area have been American producers of content, right? And now you could even argue, by the way, this is still continuing. It's not even Hollywood anymore. It's Silicon Valley. I mean, a lot of what's being produced through AI and whatever, these are ideas and futuristic. Yes, it's very Aquarian, but it also has a Neptune component, because what is AI? You can lose yourself in a reality that doesn't exist in some cases, if this artificial intelligence goes what it would, and you can just lose all contact with Saturn, right? Which is, I think there is an inherent danger, and there we'll have to navigate those waters. But again, it's coming from one sector of society that is sitting in the US with this elevated Neptune. So it's a great seller of music, film, visions, democracies. And of course, it doesn't quite ever really reach its own aspirations, but that's like a human being. You can have something very elevated. That doesn't mean you're ever going to achieve. The thing is in the trying. But I just noticed that if you're going by the rules of the planet that's right next to the zenith, not the MC, for those people who are astrologers out there, the zenith, which is the highest point, it's 90 degrees away from the ascendant, then that planet takes on a huge role, right? In a personal chart, in a political chart. So let's talk about, what do you do? Okay, so let's say Venus is wired into one of your personal planets, right? Like let's look at some possible pairings that cause problems for people. Tell me how people get into trouble if Venus, let's say, is square Neptune. What do you get there?
Well, by the way, that's another interesting thing there, because I think in the archetypes, this would probably have to be reflected somewhere. The assignation of Neptune to Pisces feels particularly accurate in that Neptune is also said to be the higher octave of Venus. And Venus is exalted in Pisces. It's supposed to like being there. And I think it's the compassion side of Venus. But you could see how Venus being a kind of personal love energy, and now Neptune, you're ramping it up. It's got this numinous divine energy. This was, by the way, Jung would use these words. That was his clash with Freud, who was so martial. He thought everything was, the sexual impulse and all that other stuff. It's more physical, more, or maybe less exalting and so forth. But Venus, Neptune, now you're getting two love principles and the possibility of being overtaken, overwhelmed, and you see this a lot, by the way, in regular chart, in individual charts. People with Venus conjunct, square, or opposed Neptune typically have a difficult time discovering a relationship they can be happy with. And you can start debating as to, are they delusional? Do they see things through rose-colored glasses? All of the above? It doesn't matter. It just turns out that way because of the archetype, in a sense, overwhelming them. And probably you'd say they connect with something that feels really amazing, because that's the thing about Neptune. It can feel incredible because you feel connected. If you're totally in love, it's like, you just think this person is going to solve all my problems. Well, they're not going to. That's not going to happen. That's where Saturn with time is laughing in the background and goes, hey, I rule time. Just give it a little bit of time and you'll see. Not true. Not true. Like, there may be a universe, there may be a place in the universe where you're in some totally timeless dimension. I think the human realm is fundamentally time ruled. We're time obsessed creatures, which is Saturn. That's why you have to put Saturn right at the very top of the list in terms of paying attention to things and so forth. So Venus, Neptune, that's the classic overload of that principle, the love principle, the unification principle. But you can see where that can become really, really dangerous, because if a person does not channel the Neptune in a harmonious way, in other words, the person's ego, the person's sense of limited self takes it, then it becomes their vision, so to speak. This is where you get a lot of these modern politicians that are doing it for themselves. It's pretty obvious that their objective is themselves. And the crazy part is they believe sometimes that they're doing it for the public. They'll tell you, no, this is what everybody wants. And you're trying to tell them, well, obviously not. Have you looked at the numbers? That would be Saturn replying and saying, well, no, because look, we can add it up and you've got more saying the opposite. They don't care because they go with their vision and they pursue it that way. So of the Neptune connections, that's one of the more striking and revealing, the extreme excess in one direction. But you could also, I bet, find charts, you see them, great musicians, very creative people, and including the person that says, no, I have a soulmate. I mean, I feel amazing in my relationship. And sometimes it'll be that the chart is really wired to make that easy. And other times they've had to fight for it. Like how you said earlier, Saturn square Neptune, being artistically linked. Although typically they'll tell you, yeah, but I had to go through a journey of, learning and, to get to that point. Yeah.
So on the comment on the Venus Neptune, I say that because one of the things that is sold most through this pitch Neptune that is so elevated in the US chart is the notion of romantic love. So, and that's a very Venus Neptune thing. And when you say longing, the longing is in you. You're just projecting it onto someone. And, when you wake up and they suddenly, they're not the person you thought, well, that's because they're still saying the same person. It's just your perception has changed because your eyes have become open to, as you say, Saturn, the limits of your own vision is the way I would look at it. I would recommend to people who have this aspect of birth and struggle with this, that there's a great book by Robert A. Johnson called We, exploring the myth of romantic love. But he really makes a case for what's going on here. And I think it's just a book I've recommended to a lot of people who are trapped in this never-ending cycle of constantly looking, because what they're looking for is not a person, but an experience. And the experience is within. You're never going to find it in the other person. You might find it for a little while, but as we all know, all illusions die at the hard end of a Saturn transit. So, or it doesn't even have to be Saturn. You just, one day you awaken and you think, wait, what have I been passing off to this person? And then of course, compassion, Neptune, Venus can make you very compassionate. And then if you love the world, here's the thing, you fall in love with everything because you have no capacity for discernment. And that's good in some ways, but in some instances, you may need to have a little bit of a discerning quality to say, well, is this good for me? Because you can fall in love with a drunk, and that drunk may not be good for you, but that's Neptune in its more insidious face. To your point about when it, people having a vision and then becoming almost, and this is one thing I do see about Neptune, and I see it in connection to another planet, Mercury. Mercury's pretty sharp, right? We'd agree it's the fastest planet. It can add things together, gives us the capacity to speak. When you unite it with Neptune, I see a lot of delusional ideas sometimes. This is one way that it shows, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's a kind of like a scary thing, because you are so convinced of it that you're wandering around, and can be very cruel about it, because I think this is the proselytizer that shows at your door and says, hey, I have one God, and you must follow this. And it can be very obnoxious, and it could actually be injurious to somebody. So that's one way. Of course, it could give people some access to the unconscious, because Neptune is the unconscious. But here we have again the problem. Does it give you access to the unconscious? And do you have enough capacity to discern, again, the word that is not a good word because it doesn't belong to Neptune, between what is nonsense and what is true? So here's the thing that was, I just did a recent dream seminar with my Sophia Collective, and the question came up about the unconscious. And Jung very famously said, look, just because it comes from the unconscious doesn't mean you don't need your conscious mind to determine what's dross and what is not dross. You still need to have some awareness. So not that every image that comes to mind, you go around saying, hey, this is it, I'm going to save the world. Or what we see often in people who go into these apocalyptic kind of scenarios, everything is going to be the end of the world. No, maybe what it means is it's the end of the way of thinking that you have, and maybe this is helpful. So I find that combination particularly problematic. It can be, depending on how it's wired in and how much consciousness a person brings to it, you can get into some pretty dicey areas, for sure.
Mercury, Neptune.
Yeah. Have you seen any extreme cases that?
Totally. Yeah. No, Mercury, Neptune, of course. Mercury as the rational thinking mind, you put it next to Neptune in any way, square, opposed, conjunct, and the possibility of the person's mind drifting into delusions, literally, things that are made up, that they've decided. Like, for example, when a person says, God talks to me, you almost think, well, you almost wonder, if God talks to you, you wouldn't be saying that.
Yes.
It's automatically you get a little worried, you get a little scared, because you are in a way, what you're really saying is, my ego has these needs, and I'm getting voices that seem to verify or justify those needs, and that is almost never true. And so you start to get delusions. So, but again, this would be what I call the low end of any planet or archetype. Archetypes have, as I understand it, high and low end. So it seems logical. I mean, the word, at least in astrology, the word logical is inside the word. So it's telling you to, use your logic around this. Mm-hmm. So the idea is always play to the high end of these archetypes. Learn what the high end is. And so, for instance, if you are the true Neptune is inclusive. So how do you justify racism? That's not inclusive. That automatically is a no-no. You can't do that. You can't be saying this group can oppress that group. You're not getting it right. That is completely wrong. People like Hitler are completely delusional, and they're people to be opposed all the time, in my opinion. Now, then you'll hear the counterpoint is to say, well, you're advocating almost like a form of communism. And it's true that Neptune is by nature going to be community oriented, right? But you find a way to do that in a way that still leaves room for the individual. That's probably the democratic experiment. If you look at democracy across all of Europe, countries in America, North America, South America, that's the target. And you can bring the US into this. It's not like Churchill said, it's a terrible system, except for all the other systems. Which system do you want? So you say, well, we're trying to achieve relative success around the Neptune. Yes, you may be one of the lucky ones that gets perfect Neptune success. I don't know, but it's difficult. It's difficult to do because, first of all, you can get into some really dicey arguments around this. There's a movie out there called My Octopus Teacher. I don't know if you've come across that.
Yeah,
okay. That octopus thing, they're showing you nature uses Neptune all the time. When an animal develops through evolution something in their skin to blend into the background so they can eat another animal, and then the other animal develops their skin to hide from another animal that wants to eat them. So this thing of deception is wired into nature. And what, are you going to tell the octopus not to do that? They're not going to make it then. There will be no octopus. They'll disappear. They rely on this. And so the idea of something is not as it seems, to enhance something is part of life. And it'll always be there in some sense. You have to figure out a way to integrate it into your life so that, let's just say, even if you're not perfect, you are relatively at least more united with the whole, which applies to the human race you're part of and the greater whole. If you realize, okay, this thing seems to be, this vast, like I think in Jungian terms, there's this vast subconscious where there are all these archetypes, some of which are very tricky and so forth. Yeah, so you're doing the best you can to channel that through your limited, like one teacher that I ran into, he described the human incarnation as like when you get a vortex in water where temporarily there's like a whirlpool event that appears to be real, but then it goes back, the water, the entire ocean would be Neptune. You're like this whirlpool and you're doing the best you can to manifest the entire thing, which is a pretty big trip.
Yeah,
it's difficult to do.
It's interesting. One thing I point out all the time is if you put all the characters in a birth chart, and you include all the planets and the nodes and whatever, you won't see a chart like yours for 7,000. I don't even know how long. It takes a long time because of just, if you think about, add up all the orbits and add up how they have to align to be exactly at the same degree, the same place, you're not going to see it. So you really are a moment in time that has never been and will not be for millennia. And so you have a certain responsibility. This was the Jungian idea, to be true to what your reality is, but in the context of a larger world, right? So to your point, I was just reading an essay by James Hillman, who was kind of one of the radical post-Jungians, where he said, it is true that everything is in you at first. You do have to locate the shadow stuff. However, it is also true that the world creates situations where you are oppressing people, and both are true at the same time. And you need to fix both the inner world and the outer world. Now, you might say, to fix the outer world, and this is a Neptunian thing, right? To fix poverty, to fix a lot of the problems we see in the outer world, you probably have to start by fixing some of the poverty consciousness you have in yourself, in the sense that, part of us wants to restrict other parts of ourselves. You start with the very basic elements, and then we project it and we say, well, that group doesn't deserve. This is what you hear from people who are radical libertarians, that I earned what I got. They totally ignore society. and say it was all them. And so it is the idea that you are both, again, the both and. I keep going with this. I think all of our problems happen from fundamentalism of thought. Like, in other words, there's only one God, there's only one idea, there's only one person, that would be me. And there's only one way to do things.
Yeah,
you know
right, that would be you.
Let me see. You've heard this message. It's been blaring at us for 4 years, or 4 years, probably like 8 years now. Anyway, the point is that if you do not take responsibility for yourself in community, then the community fails. That's just the way it is, right? But to ignore it and say, well, we had this talk from as well that, okay, the person who goes out and meditates and that's all they do all the time, it's wonderful. But I still think you have to come back into the world. You are part of a system and you are in community in some way. Now, maybe when you get to a certain age, I think the Indians have this right. Maybe it's time to retreat from the world. You've done your stuff. But I do think we do have an obligation to further the story along. And maybe the furthering of the story for us is that I am a mystic and I sit in my living room and I just manifest great thoughts and great feelings and great connection to the world. I don't know. Everybody has their own path. But part of us must realize that it's not done on an own. Again, the Neptune and the ocean is made up of drops. It's not one single drop. In some ways it is, but it's also made up of parts within the drop. So it's how to integrate those two things that I think is really difficult for people.
But this is, by the way, if you think about it, though, you see these reflections all throughout life. I mean, the whole idea in science, I remember this in high school, they said, well, there are two theories of light. There's the particle theory and the wave theory. And the wave theory would be Neptune, but light is both a particle and a wave. There's a both and. And this is the thing in mysticism, that you're holding up often two opposite thoughts and somehow not letting that disturb you. In other words, there's an ego and there's a broader spirit, and they both can coexist in some way, but it's not easy to explain how that works, because you can intellectualize it for hours and hours and hours, and in the end, you could almost say that Neptune wins in the end, in the sense that you could point to Neptune as being some kind of very deep intuition, some kind of thing that you have as you understand your linkage to that whole and how to express it in a good way. So that, for example, you're doing something and you are conscious, okay, what I'm doing now, how does this affect other people? How is this affecting other people? Or even in a relationship, when I'm doing this, what does this mean for the other person? A lot of people don't think that way. They think, I don't care about that. I mean, that's their problem. And that would not be a good thing. The more people, is the logic that you've got now 7 billion people or 8 or whatever on planet Earth, the more people that think in this way or connect in this way, the better for things going the right way. And the more people that think they are like separate islands unto themselves, potentially the more dangerous that would be.
Well, you know what? It's interesting because if you look again at the exaltation of Venus being in Pisces and the correlation or the connection or maybe the association between Neptune and Pisces, where it is now, by the way, and has been traveling for the last, I guess, 12 years or so. One thing that's interesting to me is that what has to be brought online, according to what Jung's work was showing, was connection, the Venus principle, feminine, the idea that you are not one, but many within you, but also without, like, that you're part of a system that includes many others and that we have to work together. And that is the hardest thing for anyone to do. It's interesting. He said the definition, and not only him, but many thinkers say, and it seems to me to be correct, the definition of maturity is ability to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time.
Yes.
And not act immediately and go crazy and say, and this is what happens. This is why people join cults and why they join certain groups. They want certainty because they can't handle the tension of the fear that the tension of opposites creates in your body.
Yes.
And so you avoid it, right? You avoid it through, you do something distracting like eat, so you don't have to worry about that feeling you have in your body, or you drink, or you head out and you join a group that will go out there and solve all the world's problems by, screaming into the air. But you're not solving the world problem, which is, you have to hold both these things. And sometimes a transcendent a third will emerge that combines both, but it takes a hell of a lot of waiting. Right? That's the dark night of the soul, where you just sit and you're feeling all this pain and misery and you want to go one way or you want to go the other way, but it just requires incredible maturity. And sadly, I think that is what's lacking. It's this idea that And this is what makes people, I think this is where you're seeing the right-wing movements become so loud. Right-wing movements are funded by people or fueled by people who are very fearful. And they will latch on to hate or to exclusion, because that way they can make themselves feel safe. Right? There's no courage in there. There's no heart. Courage comes from the word heart. There's no heart to say, I'm going to sit with this and I'm not going to blame it on anybody.
Yeah.
And, we're living in a difficult world, but that's also maturity, and we've got a very immature society. That's the fundamental thing. And especially North Americans, I think we're very, very, very bad at, possibly because it's a new society, but it's one that doesn't like taking responsibility for that stuff. So you will find solutions, and the solutions are often in getting angry at others. So anyway, I think at the end of the day, I want Neptune in the universe, but I think I want a little Saturn in there, a little Mars that can just discern, help us with that part that says this and not that, or this together. I can hold both these things together without having to bring out the sword and say it's only this. So it's weird. It's a real tension, and not easily solved.
Well, the thing is, it's interesting that you mentioned the opposites, the two things. Someone that influenced you and I, Pir Vilayat, the Sufi master, he coined it as reconciling the irreconcilable. He liked big words, but it's exactly that, because he often talked about things like ego and spirit. They feel like they're opposite, but they're not. Spirit uses ego uses spirit. There's a constant relationship. But the thing about Neptune too is that in the end, and it's again why it does fit, to my mind, the Pisces is a receptive sign. Venus is a more receptive planet, at least from Taurus, maybe from Libra, but because it's a relationship sign, it automatically becomes receptive and so forth. So the Neptune energy ultimately is open-ended receptivity. So you open yourself, but then you need essentially in the human realm, mind stability, which is it'd be like a Saturn-Mercury situation, Mercury being the mind. You need a stable enough attention to remain receptive and let it all go by, and it'll sort itself out. I know that sounds a little bit broad, but you can't really solve the opposites by drawing lists and comparing columns, and that's okay, but it's not going to get you there. The resolution happens spontaneously in the receptivity, where you're doing big Neptune and just being aware of what is there, and the thing itself finds its own balance, but has to be done. You can't just read it in a book. You have to actually practice. Although this could be, some people, for example, who never meditated a day in their life in the traditional sense, but are just particularly good at, they sit on their porch and they let their mind become part of the environment. They flow into the clouds and they become really good at that without ever saying, oh no, I don't do any fancy Buddhist mindfulness. I just do this thing. They're doing the very thing that they need to do. And then they find that inner peace because they're not getting trapped by any particular thing. And all those archetypes flow together. Again, easier said than done, but it's in the practice. And that's where Saturn always laughs, because Saturn's always in the background going, oh, these great ideas are always flowing around. If you don't practice, it isn't going to happen.
Awakenings are limited to people who are extraordinarily lucky, I would call them, but they're not. It's a series of steps, right? It's not going to happen spontaneously. Even Eckhart Tolle, who says he had a spontaneous awakening, said when he tells others, he said, no, this is unusual. He was suicidal, he had a break, and then suddenly something happened. But he said, but it actually takes an awareness of step by step by step. And I hate to say it, can you sit in the fire and not be consumed by it? Which means, can you have these irreconcilable things, as Pavlai would mention, and was right, and not act until the moment is right, until something has it's almost, this is what the basis of alchemy is, by the way, as well, which Jung said was the daughter of astrology, really, at the end of the day. It's the idea that is where things mix until, so lead, Saturn, becomes gold with time and patience and work. That's how it is. It's not going to happen any other way, right? Neptune can become its highest version by not acting, by not going to the basis way, and by not being delusional. So you don't hang on to the first idea that comes in. And by the way, the most important thing, Jung also said that if someone announces themselves as a prophet, then you should immediately doubt that they have no prophecy in them, because a prophet does not need to announce that they're a prophet. They are living life. You will get by the life that they live. Anyway, fascinating discussion. Next time we're going to really go to the depths with Pluto.
Oh my Lord, Pluto.
This is I know we're laughing maniacally. People are going, wow, this is like
That's a scary, but no, we go into the scary dimension.
A scary dimension. Yes, but a necessary dimension as well. Okay, well, thanks for jumping on and discussing Neptune with me.
All right, that was fun.
Until next time. Thanks for listening today. If you want to hear more about all of this, go to YouTube, where you will find Andre's channel called Astrology Alert. He posts videos there almost daily. He also teaches classes through his Patreon account. You can find me at sophiacycles.com. If you want to support my work, I've recently released a new novel called Invocation, which you may find of interest. Go to my website to see a book trailer about it. It's available in all fine bookstores, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Finally, if you like this podcast, please rate it and leave a review so that others will find it as well.